Hey folks, Steve here with another Korea Fire and Ice video. This is going to be the final report and really will serve as a post-mortem report for my second playthrough of Korea Fire and Ice. We are basically have played through every turn of the game. This game was really, like, I knew who was going to win by probably May 1951. The communists have overrun the peninsula, and they, after all accounting and assuming that the UN player got the most benefit out of the MacArthur uh, objective claims early on, the communists would have ended the game with 10 victory points or potentially 14, again, depending on uh, how that would have been counted, I guess. I mean, the point was we had ourselves over the threshold of victory, and we're even putting Pusan under threat once again, and we basically got down to Tejan, and we didn't have to do anything else. We had enough objective markers on the board that we could just pull those off to victory. The UN player basically had fallen apart. Um, this had a lot to do with a poor play of the UN on my part. So while this is certainly a major victory for the communists, there's no doubt about that. I don't think it was. I don't think it was necessarily fated to be so. I think I made a very bad error in judgment as the UN player. In the last video, the last report, I had set up my sort of defensive perimeter at the narrow choke point, uh, and I thought, okay, the northern choke point, I should say, and I thought, okay, well, I got all these guys lined up. I've got, uh, you know, uh, trenches and prepared positions and all of that, and I thought I would be in good shape, but I was very wrong. And it ended up being because the adjacency bonus, the human wave attacks of the communists, are so strong at times that if you allow the deliberate attacks to go off, if you allow those, surprise attacks to go off, where the communist player is drawing, the three chits, but the UN forces are all flipped and spent, including the HQs. Um, that's pretty nasty. Those adjacency bonuses can get you up above plus 30. You don't even really need to worry about artillery support or even, obviously no tank support due to the prepared positions, but the artillery was just gravy over immense adjacency bonuses and deliberate attack multiplier for that. That we squashed the lines, the prepared positions, and even the trenches at times might as well not even have been there. It did not matter in the long run. We overshot what we needed almost every time, and in just the order of my combats and kind of the way that I played through, I mean, I tore apart the UN line. Now I probably should have known better, but I guess in between plays, and you got to remember I'm playing this game in like 10-minute chunks when I have an opportunity to play a little bit, and then I got to go do other stuff. I thought, okay, if this is the best defensive line I could make, but this is not World War One. This is not World War One. It's not even World War Two. And those human wave assaults, those huge adjacency multiple stacked unit bonuses, were just so good that it didn't matter what else we did as the UN player. Now the UN player still had artillery support, which was useful, but it didn't make enough of a difference. And the really key critical part of this is that the UN player had a tremendous weakening of their ground support because we were doing this in winter months. So the Chinese intervention occurring in January gave us three really solid turns, winter turns, where the UN air power has the -2 to their air strength. Well, when you do that to all of your ground support planes, what you're really getting is basically one air support point per plane. And if you're trying to send as many planes as you can into that, you're still only going to have, maybe a 4, 5, or 6 air support level. Then you take into account the -3 for the preparedness penalty, and they're only adding a +3 or something. Where in a normal weather turn, you're probably looking more like a +9 or a +12 when you're sending all your air in, and it's harder to keep them in the skies in the winter. So that seems like such a crucial advantage for the Chinese, for the communist player, that at least in the second playthrough, much like the first playthrough, that advantage was just too great, and it squashed the UN. And what ended up happening was, over time, the UN forces, even with their replacements, they could only get so many units brought back on the board coherently, and the communist player, me, both players, but me as the communist player could just keep sending the waves over and over and over again. And the key thing was to try to pull back, try to keep the communists from getting deliberate attacks, but they could still get prepared attacks and get enough of an adjacency bonus that they were offsetting the air. They were able to have tank and artillery support in certain locations, and it just meant that so many units were removed. And as we replaced them, you just had fewer units that could be brought on board because the UN had positive victory points for much of the duration of that. It's not like they could call for foreign aid and try to get some units out of the destroyed pile. So over time, the UN forces, the US forces in particular, just started getting chewed up, and we couldn't replace them properly, which meant that, as the UN fell back, they just couldn't make headway. There was a point where I was trying to do the math where if the UN had kept something of a line up here, we could have seen the victory points even out to maybe it coming down to the wire where a single victory point might have decided victory. But that moment really went away pretty quickly. And it was possible, but the reality was, it was just too much of a near run thing. And the communists had plenty of objective markers. They were able to place a couple more and get a few more. And that really just made the difference, that they were able to get up over that lip, over the bring the UN to 0 victory points. They gained victory points, and it basically became a situation where the UN player could pretty much never get any more victory points, outside maybe forcing some combats or something. So once the UN player stopped having any forward momentum, and they were always going back, and there was no way to come forward again, basically, that's when they lost the game. There was just no way. There was no way they were going to push back. They had no capability to do so. They didn't have the strength to do so. And they did get Ridgway as a leader in, and Ridgway's great because he allows you to, no matter what combat, draw 3 chits and pick one. But by that point, it didn't matter. By the time Ridgway got in, and we let the communist, the UN player couldn't do anything more, and the communist player got their first victory point, the communist player, playing the little victory point objective marker minigame, delayed getting their own victory points as long as possible. They placed a lot, and they revealed, but they didn't claim until just the right time, where they knew. And I worked this out looking at the turn track and the victory points and figuring out how many turns were left, that, if I claimed and I revealed here and then picked them all up, mathematically I would come out ahead, and sort of delaying Ridgway coming on, because Ridgway might have been the big difference to allow the UN player to have some oomph back, being able to select the combat chits, and just making it so that the communist player couldn't make any more gains. But it just worked out not to the UN's favor. They couldn't make that up, and the communists basically ensured that they were going to keep getting victory points via the objective markers they had already basically won and had a claim, and they kept the UN player from getting any more. And the amount of objective markers that were on the map that had just been around for a while, they had enough to bring themselves up over to victory. Now, maybe the UN player could have mitigated that a little bit by focusing more on removing communist objective markers. I guess that's part of the little mini game. You got to decide: are you going to remove objective markers or place your own? I think the UN player tried to balance that, removed ones that made sense, but had to place their own just to make it competitive. Maybe if they had done, maybe if they had done a little bit better. And actually, now that I think about it, it's really the opposite over here. It would have been possibly 7 communist victory points, not 11 at the end. But depending on how you want to look at that whole thing. Sorry, I'm rambling. I'm getting off track. I just realized stuff as I'm looking at the map. So yeah, I mean, it is entirely possible that the UN player maybe could have done a better job and maybe squeaked out some sort of win, but what would have made that happen just didn't happen. That's just the way it rolled out. I don't think it was. I think my idea of having a defensive perimeter with the trenches and prepared positions was a bad one. That was a bad play. It was a bad play in the first playthrough. For some reason, I thought with the second, because it was a fresh game and I kind of got to restart, that maybe that would work a little bit better. Ultimately, I think what the UN players should have done in retrospect, as I look back on it, was to try to do a screen or something where um, have a coherent line maybe, but around these areas where the communists would come in. And I'm sorry, there's a glare. Maybe if I do that, that's a little bit better. Um, along these roads, maybe what I should have done is put out some sacrificial lambs, maybe some UN units or Republic of Korea units, and just place them sort of like up here along the roads, so that when at critical choke points as well, so that when the communist player has the Chinese intervention occur and they move these units, 15, 10, 5 movement points down the roads, they eventually get to the point where they just can't get much farther, or they have to navigate around Zocs, because the Zocs are still in place until the communist activation round when the Chinese intervene. So maybe if you set out a screen here at critical choke points, the communists kind of get bunched up, and when they get that surprise action, um, they're slowed down a little bit, uh, and then that way, yeah, you're definitely going to lose some units, but maybe it won't be as bad, and the rest of your units back here, wherever, are in a better shape to retreat and everything. Now the problem is when you have surprise, all the units are flipped at first, and then so are the HQs. So you're never gonna get full activations until the next month ticks over. So if you find that the Chinese intervene during a two-turn winter turn, or I'm sorry, a two-turn winter month, that's going to be worse for you as the UN player. You would rather have them maybe come in November, where it's just one turn for that month, and then you get your HQs to refresh, and then you can actually do stuff. But if you have two turns, the communist player definitely has a lot more ability to kind of rip stuff apart up here before you have a chance to get your stuff put together. On the second turn of winter, you do get the units refreshed, and they potentially have the ability to strategically move south again, but they need to be outside of a communist Zoc. And so that screen, if you set it up, what you're hoping to be able to do is have enough of a screen that you still get enough units that are fresh back here that you can strategically move them back, and then your HQs hopefully are in good shape, and then by the time the next month rolls over, you're just in much much better shape to have a coherent defense. And that truly, I think the name of the game, and after a couple of plays, it just solidifies more in my mind. At every step, at every juncture of the game, you want to keep units alive as much as possible. Give up territory. If you give up territory, it may mean your opponent can't place objectives nearby. They've always got some places that they can place objectives, even with my house rules. But you want to keep those units alive. If I had kept my UN units alive better here in the late game with Ridgeway coming back, I would have gotten some offensive oomph again. The skies get clear once we get out of winter, and then it becomes a tighter situation, and I maybe could have pushed the communists back in a couple of places, and had an opportunity to get some objective points back, some VPs on the board for the UN player, that maybe I could have dragged things back into the UN space at some point, kind of like what historically you would think kind of happened, right? Things kind of, they pushed back, communists pushed south of Seoul, but then got sort of pushed back again, and it sort of ended up right over here. I mean, I think that would have been conceivable if I had done a better job of keeping the UN units alive. I didn't do that. That weakness or that mistake The communists were able to sort of capitalize on that, which brought the game to its present conclusion with the UN looking to maybe evacuate out of what is it, Kunsan. So yeah, it was, I think this playthrough went a lot smoother. I think with the house rules that I honestly I think they need to be errata rules, not just house rules. There needed to close a loophole in the objective marker verbiage that's in the 3.0 rule set. Um, but I think with that absolved or removed a lot of the weird gaminess loophole stuff, and I had to actually place objective markers in a way that was more coherent, that made sense with the combats that were going on and in the direction the game was moving. So that helped a lot. I think my familiarity with the rules at this point just made it a much smoother, more enjoyable game experience. Like any game, once you know the rules, you can play through it better. You kind of know how it works. So I'll say I definitely had more fun this second playthrough because I wasn't distracted with that, with the weird objective marker stuff. I sort of solved that problem. I think I have the right verbiage to use for this. And I need to think about how I want to share it. And what it may just be is I post a document to Board Game Geek for now, citing unofficial errata and recommended house rules, and then let Adam see that stuff and decide what he wants to do with it. But we need a 3.1 version of the rules, I think, to kind of finish up this game in terms of polishing it and letting it have have its value to other people, to be played at its full potential. And to me, that's like this second playthrough was closer to this game's full potential than the first playthrough. And I think there's there's certainly still oddities to the game. Like I think there's the fact that I knew who was going to win, and it was militarily that way on the board. It's just the objective markers didn't reflect that yet. It's kind of different than a lot of games, right? You grab a victory city, you grab a victory point place or objective or whatever, you get the victory points right away or within a turn. Here, because of the victory point mini game, the objective marker mini game, you don't see the fruits of how well you're doing until much later. But if you play the objective marker rules the way I did with the house rule, I mean, there is a level, I guess, that throughout the entirety of the game, from turn 1 to turn 30, whatever it is, turn 29 or whatever the final turn is, if you do well in the early game, that should benefit you over the long haul of the game. The communist player performed very well early. They built up a huge bank of victory points. They nearly won in the early part of the game. The communist player pushed them back, but they were working out of that deficit of victory points. So the communist player eventually started to lose, right? The UN player got their victory points into the positive. They were doing well, for themselves. They maybe should have kept pushing and tried to get even more victory points, right? And set up a screen and maybe that's the whole gamble up here. It's worthwhile to go up here to start setting up those screens, because sorry to have to do this. You can set up choke points better up here than here, where it gets a little more spaghetti with the roads, and it's harder to shut down a road line. But hey, if you plop, here and here and here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Maybe it takes 9 units, but you effectively create choke points along these road lines so that those Chinese surprises aren't nearly as bad as they could be, or maybe would be, because you're slowing them down a little bit. There's different ways to look at it, but I should have, as the UN player, pushed up more, maybe try to get more victory points, try to do more stuff, and then when the communists have their resurgence, you have to play that situation. So it's like each phase, each wave of the game, the initial wave, North Korean player, you still want to do everything you can to perform well. You want to hit as many places as you can. You want to get as many victory points as you can for the most part in the early game, because you would like to shut down all four ports and win an automatic victory. It's feasible. You have to play very well, but it's feasible. If you fail to do that and you find yourself in a huge victory point advantage, then the UN player is going to get a ton of foreign aid support, right? That is a balancing part of the game, and it makes sense to do that. But I still think there's an incentive, like for the North Korean player, to still do as good as they can do, because you want to have that nice, bit of victory point, uh, stockpile, I guess, to take losses in combat with them. Again, I'm not sure I really I don't think I like the simulation aspect of that. I don't know what's really happening when I give up victory points in combat. But if you build up enough victory points, okay, you're not going to win. You realize you're not going to win the game outright. You're not going to get enough to get 21, and the UN wave is coming. That reversal is going to happen. You can start using that victory point currency to kind of keep, invest in the long game, keep units alive rather than removing them, trying to get them north where it's safe, or at least where it's easier to keep them safe, and just keep running away, right? Keep moving, keep getting out as much as possible. And if you can do well at that, right, I think like as a defender, you have to play well in the game. You have to know when to pull back. You have to know how to keep your units alive, because basically each side gets that opportunity to play the offensive player and the defensive player until it gets, crazy at the very end where either side can push. So, early on, sure, as the UN player, you try to save those South Korean units. You're probably not going to have an easy time doing that, but the North Korean player is going to push. When that switch happens, the UN player obviously wants to eliminate as many North Korean units as possible. The less North Korean units there are on the board, early, the fewer there will be later when the communists get their human wave attacks, right? You just want to try to take them apart. And then, you want to get as many victory points as you can, because the reversal wave is going to come, right? So you want to build up a lot of victory points. You want to capture what you can get the victory points that you can get, and then the communist player is going to get their wave again. Same thing's going to occur, right? You're going to marshal your forces. You're going to try to save them, right? You want to slow down the communists. You want to negate their advantages where you can, and hope that in the late game, as the UN player, you get Ridgeway. You figure out a way that Ridgeway's on the board, and you use his advantages, and hopefully you've kept your units alive. That now, it's a real slugging match, and you can survive the winter. And if you can survive the winter in good shape, the UN player, has the opportunity to slow down the communists, regain whatever victory points the communists can get at that point will then be balanced against how much you had before that. And then it's still that, tug of rope battle, right? Who's going to get the next victory points? Maybe if the fighting is all centered around the original DMZ area, then it could be, these two towns or these handful of towns around the border become super important, because they're the places where you're going to place objective markers in the final phases of the game, hoping to edge out the victory, right? I think all of that's possible. It didn't happen in my game because I screwed up as the UN, but I see that as all feasible and possible in the game. The one interesting thing I found at the end is that, for sure, and this is to history, even if the communist player can push down here and start doing all this fun stuff, beating up on the UN player, they truly, just like the history, have a huge logistical problem. There's a point where the communist player gets some really good MiG ace units, and they have a 6 air-to-air rating, which is awesome. I think they're the best units in the game for that. I shot down some UN planes. They didn't get the victory point in Big Alley, but they shot down some UN planes. I have a number of UN planes that are on their reduced side. There wasn't a huge major air war, but the communist player did what they could with their MiGs, and that had an effect on the game. But ultimately, the UN strategic bombing campaign kept the communist player infrastructure to the minimum all the time. The minimum it can go is 2. So if communist infrastructure is at 2, there's no reason to do more strategic bombing. That's as low as it can go. And so the communist player only had 2 or 1 supply points to ever use. Sometimes I'd be trying to use points to repair all my damaged airfields. The UN bombing took out all the communist airfields, so eventually, even though my MiGs were doing well, I couldn't even fly them anymore. I was out of airfields. I couldn't repair them without using what little supply I had left. And I needed that to kind of keep my units going, because once you're south of the border again, um, the communist HQs have to, you're trying to spend some supply to refresh those HQs so you can keep operating, keep attacking. And I found that in some cases it was like crap. Once I activate one HQ, like that's it. I can't refresh that one, and if I need to make this last all month, 4 more turns, I'm only going to get to attack with 6 units, right? Regularly, depending on how I want to space out using my HQs, and if it's going to cost me, multiple supply points to refresh an HQ, then for a while I had to keep them north of this border, but then that means they can only go count so far down south. So I definitely, even though the communist player was winning in the end, I was heavily reduced. There wasn't as much stuff I could do. Even if I wanted to, I have tons of guys, I have tons of units, I could do human wave attacks, but if I can only activate 6 at a time, it's not like I'm doing a huge amount of stuff. I can only focus on a specific area and hope that that's enough to get me something that I want, or to hurt the UN player enough. So that much felt right. It was something that I had to be concerned about. And what was funny is, like, you end up with all these North Korean HQs that are strewn about the map because you just get them as reinforcements and they don't get destroyed. You always have HQs, but they can't activate Chinese units. So I felt that, like, oh man, if only I had saved some more of these North Korean units, they'd at least be a little bit more valuable because I could activate them more. But the problem is, you never get replacement points for the North Koreans. So this weird, like, auxiliary force of North Koreans were circumstantially beneficial to, like, hold and take towns and territories, but they were never really so great other than to support combats, because there was only so many of them on the board. I had more than enough HQs, but I had, sometimes it felt like more HQs than units, and they were very brittle. And so I ended up sitting very high on the Chinese replacements. I was happy to lose units. It didn't really matter if I lost too many Chinese units. So there's that weird dynamic, right? I could feel that tension of, gosh, if only I had kept more North Korean units alive, I'd have a little bit more bandwidth to operate here in the late game, but I don't. So there you go. There's the challenge. I did end up losing, it's like 5 or 6 communist units due to human wave attacks that either failed because I worked out the support and the dice went, the dice were rolled and the communists would roll a 2 and the UN would roll a 10, and we would lose. I didn't think we would lose, but then I would lose. And so my units that were overstacked as part of that human wave attack got eliminated. I even had a successful combat where I didn't have enough advance after combat movement that all of the flipped, spent Chinese communist units had somewhere to go that wasn't overstacked, and I lost units. So again, and this was like okay, it worked in the first game, will it work in the second game? The human wave attacks, very potent, very powerful. You can avoid the worst of it if you can set up your attacks right and work it out better to where you won't lose units. But sometimes you lose and stuff sucks and you lose a bunch of units. Sometimes you succeed and it's just too congested depending on where you're at, and you lose units. But I think it's like ammunition, bodies as ammunition. The Chinese have that advantage. You can do that. You make up for the UN air power with that capability. Um, so yeah, I mean, this game certainly went much smoother You didn't have wacky stuff happen. We did not have, though it was feasible, the die rolls just made it not happen. We could have had atomic release as the UN player. That did not happen. We did not have Soviet intervention like the first playthrough. A lot of that comes down to, again, the house rules for objectives. We didn't, things didn't get super weird and swingy in terms of victory points. It felt much, not constrained, because that sounds like it's a bad thing. It felt a lot tighter, and it made a lot more sense. And so, I mean, maybe you could look at, in the end game, there should have been something dramatic should have happened, but it felt right. We didn't have anything too wacky happen here. My poor strategy, put the game in the state that it was in. If I had played better as the UN player, maybe it would have been closer to a tie. But I think, when I'm looking at the game situation, I think it all worked out well. So, the next video that I'm going to do for this is going to be the full review. I'm not exactly sure how soon I will get to that, probably within the next few days, I think. So it's, hopefully this week I'll have that out. I don't want the post-mortem video here to be a stand-in for the review. I want to save that for the review. I think there's a lot to be said about the game, compared to what folks' initial thoughts of it might have been when it first came out, versus, what is the game's true potential. Ordinarily, you would hope that when the game is published, it's at its full potential. I think this game, it took some work. I had spent 10 extra bucks. It was like $9, $10, with tax, to print the 3.0 rules. I obviously have some errata to point out and some house rules that are recommended. So I had to put some work into this a little bit, more than maybe I should have had to at the end of the day. But the nice thing about this kind of situation is it means that others who would want to play this can learn from what I've gone through here. Not that it was a bad experience. I put some work in. I think some folks can benefit from that. But the game is certainly better, than I think folks would probably give it credit for, in the big scheme of things. There's certainly aspects of this game that I think are just going to be deal breakers for folks, and I totally understand that. That is a very legitimate position. This game will not work for everybody. There's just some. It is non-traditional, and some of those things that it's non-traditional about, are going to hit people sideways, I think, in a lot of ways. And I think if you want a very traditional war game experience because of that, this might not work out for you. If you're willing to kind of be a little more open-minded, then maybe it's something worth checking out. I mean, if you look at any war game and you're having fun, that's a good thing, right? And then it just comes down to, is the fun reaching some other threshold, right? Is the game historical enough? Is the simulation working? Is the abstract simulation, the bits of the simulation that are more abstract, are they too abstract to be sensical to you? All of those things I'll probably explore more in the review, and guide, hopefully, folks to deciding, is this game worthwhile or not. So I don't want to have, don't want to spoil the review, but I think there's a game here, and I think some folks should take a look at it, particularly those who probably bought it and haven't played it, or thinking of selling it because it hasn't been rated well, and there's just a lot of poor views of it. But I don't know. So yeah, I'm gonna quit rambling. This was an interesting game experience. I'm glad that I did a playthrough too. I'm glad I did the second playthrough. I think that helped solidify in my mind a lot of what I thought about the game. I know some folks were like, "Oh, Steve's going to be playing Create Fire and Ice forever now because he's playing again." Me doing it off camera allowed me to do things a little bit faster. I could do it in time without feeling like I'm wasting your time. I could just get through the game again, share thoughts as I went in short form. But I'm really glad that I did it, and that this is going to inform the rest of what I have to say in the review for sure. So if you're watching this, thanks for watching. Obviously, this is not the same as a deep, detailed walkthrough of a turn. This is the aftermath, so just trying to reflect on the game as I've experienced it, and there's plenty to think through for this and all of that. So I'll pull all that together in a coherent video here soon to come. So thanks for watching, guys. We will see you in the next video. If you like this video, hit like. If you haven't already, subscribe to see more stuff like this. We'll be taking a look at some other games here in the time to come. I'm still deciding what happens next. But it's going to be fun either way. So thanks for watching, guys. Take care. Keep on gaming.